Good morning again. I'm very pleased to see so many people out here. Last week I would have bet $100 it'd only be about 75, and then beginning this week I was getting calls from all over this area, from the Nilchik, Anchorage many times last night, saying save me a ticket for the Russian meal. So I hope the ladies of the Russian Orthodox Church are very busy today because I increased the number of 50 people. So that is encouraging. It really shows interest on our peninsula and in our community. We'll begin our session today by pledging the allegiance to our flag. So if you'll stand with me. I pledge the allegiance to the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. When I first came to Alaska, if anything went wrong, the biggest excuse and scapegoat or cop-out was, this is Alaska. Well, we've got some changes in the program, and this is Alaska. I got a call this morning from B. Langness. She said she had a bad night and she's going to the hospital, so you can strike her name and instead put Mr. Gary Holthouse. He's with the Alaska Humanities. That's number one correction. William Jorgensen did call me much earlier, and he is in Seattle. So standing in for him will be Dr. Bob Frederick. And then for representing the Kenai Native Association, our Chief George Miller flew to Anchorage this morning. His assistant, John Monfort, went to Seattle. And hopefully we'll have many representatives of KNA who will be talking to you about the native land claims or whatever they want to talk to you about. They have at least 45 to 50 minutes. You've got that much time, so we hope that you will be talking with us. I've mentioned to you about the 1-hour credit, and if you have not signed up for the 1-hour credit and you still want to do so, you may slip out and register with Betty England. We are very pleased that people have this opportunity for that 1-hour credit. And if you haven't signed our register, please do so. We want everyone here to sign our register. There's a map of the school in case you haven't seen one. It's on the end of the table out there, along with the other data. And it gives you the location of the cafeteria, the teacher's lounge, the boys' room, and the girls' rooms. Another change, which might be good news for you, is that we lowered the price of the meal tickets for the cafeteria to $1.15. Again, this is Alaska. The chickens didn't come in. So Mrs. Hofstetter said, we'll just serve what we serve the students. I said, that's fine. She said, we'll just charge $1.15. So if you haven't picked up your meal tickets and you paid for the cafeteria tickets, you will have money coming. And if I made an error of giving you too much money or too little money, just tell my secretaries out there and we'll try to adjust it later. This is more or less of the minute work. And if you have not purchased tickets, you may pay as you go through the line. Don't give us any more money. That's one of my biggest headaches. So I think the most popular thing has been the Russian meal, and those ladies are working industriously. Father Targonsky of the Russian Orthodox Church told me this morning that his church would be open, or he confirmed it this morning. We talked about it earlier. And Mrs. Peterson will be at our museum. And if you don't know where that is, it's as you are downtown, you'll see a big sign. It says museum, and it shows the area, or word of mouth. It's hard to say just where that church is. You get down to Old Kenai, you'll get lost if you've never been there before. But it's in that vicinity of, and the museum is at the upstairs of the Fort Kenai. There are some interesting things there, and we're kind of proud of our museum, and we're proud of the fact that we do have a Russian Orthodox Church as our heritage to the Russian culture. Those people who are interested in the bicentennial Commission. There is a meeting of the members of the Bicentennial or who are working on the Mayor's Bicentennial Committee and those people from Anchorage or Bicentennial work. There is a meeting Friday morning in the City Manager's office at 7:30. And you may have breakfast or whatever you wish. There is a cafe there. I'll mention what we have on the menu today, and it's enchiladas. Maybe you heard it over the radio. Next on our program, I'd like to introduce you to our principal. He's been very cooperative with our conference, Dr. Colin Morris.
It's a pleasure for me to welcome all of you on behalf of Kenai Central High School. I think this kind of an experience is very good for the high school, and I know it'll be very good for you. I feel kind of privileged. I know there's some quite talented people behind me as well as in front of me, and I hope you'll all relax and enjoy the day. I think it'll be a good experience for all of you. What I'm going to do now for just a couple of minutes is give you a very brief history of this schooling in Kenai, at least. I've got a 2-page paper written by Shirley Dennison, who's the chairman of our Social Studies Department. She wrote it for our handbooks, our faculty and student handbooks, and I thought it was kind of appropriate for a historical conference. So if you'll just bear with me for a couple of minutes, I'll give you a brief outline of the history of the high school, at least in the Kenai area. And again, this was written by Shirley Dennison. As far as anyone knows, the first school was built in Kenai by the Russians and operated by them even during territorial days. It was built on the site of the present Fort Kenai and served primarily as a religious school for the Alaska natives of Kenai. At that time, Kenai was a small fishing village and was accessible only by boat in the summer and by dog team in the winter. The road system was opened in the late 40s, but was barely passable until 1949, and then only during the winter and midsummer. The airfield was built in the early 40s and has been expanded and improved every year since that time. After World War II, the population of Kenai was increased as many returning veterans and their families began homesteading the area. The entire village of Kenai occupied a federal reserve for the airfield, and few permanent homes were built because the occupants could not obtain title to the land. However, as homesteading land was opened, permanent dwellings were built, and by 1948 it became apparent that the old condemned frame building built in 1926 was no longer adequate as a school building, and that the villagers persuaded the territorial legislature to provide funds for a new school. Construction was begun on a steel and reinforced concrete school designed by one of the teachers, Mrs. Ruth Connolly. A split-level structure was selected because it provided the greatest space, required the least heat, and presented a low profile so that low-flying planes would be more likely to miss the chimney. Everyone in the community attended the opening in the spring of 1950. This building is now the center section of the Kenai Elementary School, located on this Kenai Spur Road just across from the mall. With the construction of Wildwood Station in the early 50s and the subsequent arrival of military personnel, the school was expanded twice until further expansion was not possible. Then the discovery of oil in the area further swelled the population. Statehood was granted for the city of Kenai, and the city of Kenai was incorporated. One of the first acts of the city of Kenai was to bond itself for the construction of a new high school. Construction of the present Kenai Central High School was begun in 1963. The building was nearly ready for occupancy when the Friday earthquake of 1964 jolted Kenai. A few light fixtures in the library, some ceiling tile, and other minor damage was sustained, but the damage was repaired and the building opened to its first students in the fall of 1964. Since that time, the walls have been pushed out, portables brought in, and new shop buildings and a vocational building has been added. These modifications have provided for changes in student needs, and new modifications have been proposed. And I'll intercede here for just a second to say that by next year, theoretically at least, we're supposed to have a new section down on this end with 8 more classrooms and a new library, and on the other end, going out that direction, there will be a swimming pool and another small gymnasium. Before 1950, students were offered correspondence courses with assistance from the elementary school staff whenever needed, or students were sent outside by their parents to stay with relatives or friends until their high school courses were completed. Some of the Alaska Native students attended Mount Edgecombe School, and a few Kenai students went to Anchorage or Seward to school. However, by 1950, there were 10 high school students enrolled in the Kenai Territorial School that had just been built. In 1952, all 4 of the graduating seniors went on to schools of higher education. Kenai has not achieved a 100% record since that time. Membership in the graduating classes has steadily increased in number, and soon second-generation Kenai high graduates will be receiving their diplomas. No one remembers why Kenai's athletic teams were called cardinals. The cardinal is not an Alaskan bird, but the cardinals are truly representative of the courage, skill, and love of the game, whatever it is, that typifies Alaskans. Track was the first organized sport offered to Kenai students, since it required no special facilities. But basketball has been the major sports activity since the first gymnasium was built in the second addition to the Kenai Territorial School. Mr. Jim Evenson joined the teaching staff in 1958, accepted the coaching position, and soon the Cardinals became a major contender for new state championships. Wrestling was introduced by Jerry Neer in 1962 and gained momentum each year thereafter. Gymnastics was introduced in 1968, but has not yet gained the status of a major sport. Kenai's first football team was trained in 1968 by Coach Bruce West and played its first game on the only available grass field, Wildwood Station, that fall. Many Kenai residents had never seen either wrestling or football until Kenai presented those sports, and knowing nothing of the game, it was truly amazing that both sports are so well supported. The cheerleaders and pep club were organized at the same time that the first basketball team began playing, and the Girls Athletic Association was established at Kenai in 1960. The Cardettes or Fly Girls were not seen until 1966, and this was a student-motivated activity. The first high school chorus was organized by Mrs. Jessie Munson in 1957, and the first band was started in 1960-61 by Mr. John Gunnison. Senior class plays have been a tradition at KCHN since the first graduating class, and in some years each class, freshman through senior, presented a play. Soccer teams, ping pong teams, hockey teams, forensic teams, and debate teams have come and gone as the students' interests have changed. Some of these teams are being reorganized. Various clubs have existed since the earliest days of the school. For example, the Pep Club, the Spanish Club, Letterman's Club, and Student Council. The National Honor Society was first chartered in 1963 under the direction of Mrs. Shirley Dennison, and has been active since that time. The first school annual was published in 1961 under the leadership of Mrs. Irene Anderson. Its name, Kaknu, means, quote, village by the Kenai River, unquote, and was selected by its first staff. The first newspaper was published in 1958. The name was chosen by the student body and has been retained since that time despite several attempts to change it. Both publications have increased in popularity, and some of the earlier copies have become cherished possessions. Traditional activities such as the annual Spanish Club dinner, homecoming, junior-senior prom, pep week, and talent show have continued for more than the past 10 years. But the turkey tourney, freshman initiation, and National Honor Society slave sale and others have been deleted from the activity schedule. The senior class installed in 1973 the school symbol, the Kenai Cardinal, which is now on the floor in the Commons area. As each new class graduates, old traditions are forgotten and new ones established. In Kenai's ever-shifting interests and concerns, its restless population, and its changing and growing economy, Kenai Central High School has shown its adaptability and is destined for many more changes in the future as it adjusts to the needs of the community it serves. And again, I'd like to compliment Shirley Dennison for looking up this information and writing it down and making it available for the people of the community. And before I sit down, I'd like to compliment Peggy Thompson. She's done a good deal of work for this conference. And again, as far as the school is concerned, you're welcome to make yourselves accessible to any part of the school, and it'll be accessible to you. If there's any way that I can help you, or any teacher or any of us can be of service, please let us know. And again, thank you for coming.
We are a part of the Kenai Mayor's Committee. This was formed some time ago for bicentennial work. And what you are participating in today is a part of the total bicentennial era for the city of Kenai. Some of the activities in the future we hope will be more in the theatrical line. So now I introduce you our mayor, Jim Elson.
Thank you, Peggy. I really think you have an impressive program, and I think you should be really pleased with the turnout that you've accomplished. I was a little disappointed when I looked through the program that one area in history that I've always had a special interest for wasn't included. There's nobody in there talking about building inspection. Over the years, the last, well, I'll say since I graduated from high school, I've probably inspected a great many of the buildings that are preserved throughout the West and Southwest. I've gone through all the missions in California, and from San Diego on through West Texas, down to Rio Grande, on to Houston, and on up to Tucson, Phoenix. And by the way, one of the most interesting I found was there's a white one, and I can't remember the name of it to save me. It's just outside of Tucson. If you're ever down that way, be sure and see that one. But that sort of follows your format as in the vein of the religious experience, in the vein of the American experience, of course, along with all those. So been through numerous forts that have been reconstructed, was in jail at Yuma, went to the saloon at Langtree, where Judge Rory Bean was. Often wondered why there weren't more missions around there, but maybe didn't. Oh, there's a bordello in San Antonio that was saved by the local historical society. They took on the city of San Antonio, the state of Texas, and the federal government against urban renewal. I think they had the support of the Daughters of the Revolution, too. Yeah. I also spent quite a bit of time in the Indian experience. I lived a year in Phoenix and spent a lot of time up on the plateau around the Grand Canyon, going through the old villages there, the ruins, some of which have been reconstructed. In the Verde Valley, the Tuzigoot, which is a name I can always remember, Montezuma's Castle, very remarkable things. And anyway, over the years of wandering around through these different buildings and so on, you know, I often think, well, now who did this? Who reconstructed this? And that's about as far as the thought got. Maybe occasionally I conjure an image of some white-haired old man with a mustache and an eyepiece and a couple college kids putting these stones together, whatever. But it wasn't until recently, when I first heard about this conference on the Kenai Area History, that I realized the enthusiasm and the dedication that goes in to making many of these projects and in bringing the history of this country to the local citizenry or to the general public. I don't know how many of you can imagine the hours of dedicated work that these people have put in order to put on this conference. It's really remarkable. And the energy and the optimism of them. And I can't help but feel that this is really going to be a significant thing, experience in itself, in what you're going to have these next 2 days. You know, it's really a very important thing. I'm very pleased to see that it's being put on the tape, videotape, and I hope you will all share in the history of Kenai, enjoy it, and while you're staying in town, if you have any problems, you need any help, don't hesitate to call City Hall. We're in the airport terminal building. There's also the Chamber of Commerce office in the mall, and you're most welcome to come by if you have a problem or need information or anything. Call on either one of us. We'll be glad to serve you. Just don't be surprised if you call City Hall and you ask about something and they say, it's not my job. At any rate, welcome to Kenai. Have a good conference. I think it's going to be a very significant event in our history. So, thank you.
Before our mayor found out that this program is going to be on tape, he was just going to get up and say hello. He's a typical politician.
Don't forget I was 72 years old last time I was on the stage.
That's right. He keeps harking back to Mark Twain. I would just like to take a few minutes and introduce some of the people who are going to be serving as the experienced chairman and as the consultant. And if you'll hold your applause until we get everybody introduced, and as I read off your name, please stand and remain standing until I've introduced everyone. The native experienced chairman is Alan Boris, who's a geologist and anthropologist at the community college. Alan's over here. He's being assisted by William Workman, who is an anthropologist from Alaska Methodist University, and Doug Rager, who is a regional archaeologist for the U.S. Forest Service, and is a local man. Mary Willits refers to him as Dougie Rager. James Carey, who is with the Alaska Native Language Center, is a linguist and will be working on the Kenaitze language with Peter Kalifansky, Bertha Monfor, and Fedosia Sakalov. The chairman of the Russian experience is Sister Victoria from St. Herman's Pastoral School, and she is being assisted by Inez Haas. The chairman of the American experience is Mrs. Mary Willits, who is being assisted by Morgan Sherwood from the University of California and Claus Naskey from the University of Alaska. Let's give these people a nice round of applause. Our next speaker kind of disappointed us. It's not Beatrice Langness, who is in the hospital this morning, and we certainly hope that she's all right. But our next speaker is a person who is no stranger to the community. He was a pastor in the area for several years, at which time he tried mightily to save my soul, but he totally failed. He also has served as the admissions director for Alaska Methodist University, and he's very important as far as this conference is concerned, because several months ago, I believe it was last spring, he was down lining up programs for the National Endowment, and Peggy and I got to talking with him about the possibility of this conference, and the grant was submitted to the Alaska Humanities Forum Board, for which he serves as the executive director. And it's my pleasure now to introduce Mr. Gary Holthaus.
I don't remember trying to save his soul. If I failed, maybe that's no great loss. It's a privilege to be here and to bring you greetings from Beatty Langness, who is in the hospital, and I hope getting over whatever it is that put her there. And also to bring you greetings from the State Committee of the Alaska Humanities Forum, which is one of the sponsors of this conference. If any of you do have questions about the bicentennial or its purposes, the chances are good that I can't answer them. But I would be happy to put you in touch with Beatty or with her office. And if you are serious about asking the Bicentennial Commission for funding for a particular project, I'd be glad to carry that message back and give her any names and addresses or phone numbers which you may wish to leave with me. I would like to take just a minute to talk about one of the values of history which I think is often overlooked, and that is that history provides us with an opportunity to know what we are missing. And I'm very pleased with this conference, as part of its native experience, to have included a section on the language and a linguist, because I believe that all over Alaska today, Native people are feeling a real sense of loss with the gradual disintegration and disuse, disappearance in some cases, of their language. So when I talk about knowing what we are missing from history, I don't mean something that is sentimental and nostalgic, but rather something that is very complex and important. And in this particular case, I refer specifically to the loss of language and to the loss of personal identity which that entails. I'm also pleased that you have approached the conference in the fashion that you have, by dealing with the native experience and the Russian experience and the American experience, because I think one of the values of history is the opportunity to look at alternative lifestyles. That's a phrase that's been relatively popular in our country the last few years. But history offers us an opportunity to do that in a kind of safe way, by seeing how other people dealt with the environments in which they found themselves. And the Kenai Peninsula is certainly one which is rich in a variety of lifestyles. And I think you have chosen an appropriate course, therefore, for the conference. I also hope that it is possible for people to use what they have learned of the past on behalf of the present. And I hope that when you leave this place, you will use the information or the insight, the wisdom which has come to you from this conference to examine contemporary issues and contemporary lifestyles. And perhaps if all of us had a better sense of history and a better understanding of who we have been in the past, we would have a better opportunity to make wise public policy decisions now and in the future. So I salute you on this enterprise and wish you well, and thank you for the opportunity to participate.
There are some other people who have been very important in our conference. I'll read off some more names, and again, if you'll hold your applause until we introduce them all and then give them a rousing round of applause. We have Dr. Robert Frederick, who is the Executive Director of the Alaska Historical Commission, who was quite active, along with Morgan Sherwood, in the Conference on Alaskan History, which this conference is based upon. We've more or less tried to segregate one area of Alaska and do what they did back in 1967. The art sketches for the conference book were done by the Kenai Central High School Art Department, James Evenson, instructor. As you note, we have an audiovisual taping with the crew here. The instructor is Tom Ackerley. You can obtain a college credit through the Kenai Peninsula Community College. The articles in the resource book are written by the experienced chairman. Saturnine Haywood and Deanne Mapes assisted in correspondence. Gail Glad and Jean Haller are coordinating the Russian and Indian dancing this evening at the Russian dinner. David Chin is serving as the finance chairman. The hosts and hostesses are the Kenai Central Alaska History classes, Louis Greer, instructor, Susan Crane and Michael Linhartson, chairman. And the Kenai Native Association is represented by George Miller, Fedosia Sakaloff, Peter Kalifornsky, Bertha Monfort, and John Monfort. Pictures of the conference are being taken by the Cocknoo photographers here at the high school. Mrs. Chris Shepard, instructor. Colin Morse has been very helpful, as has the entire staff at the high school. The publication of the conference book is by the graphics art class, Patrick O'Connell, instructor, and they finished up this morning during the wee hours of the morning. The Russian meal is being put on by the ladies of the Russian Orthodox Church, chaired by Roberta Ivanov. The conference book was typed by the Kenai Clerical Corporation here at the high school, Mrs. Alexander, instructor, Catherine Main, office manager, and the transportation was arranged by Mr. Mike Christian. And the conference is being put on through funds provided by the Alaska Humanities Forum in conjunction with the grant application by the City of Kenai through the Kenai Mayor's Advisory Committee on History and Tradition. And I think these people deserve a nice round of applause for their work. The book, which has been prepared, is going to be, there is no charge for the book, and I believe that we're going to distribute that after Morgan Sherwood finishes with the keynote address. Is that correct? There's going to be a coffee break? But it's just right after Morgan's address. Okay. There was some rumor going around that there was a charge for this book, but there is no charge for this book, and this is what it looks like, and we hope that you enjoy it. Our keynote speaker is certainly no stranger to Alaska. He's written several books on Alaska, and he has another book which has been accepted for publication on this area of Alaska. He has a summer home in Halibut Cove, and he went to school with some people that many of us know, Diana Tillion and Ruth and Chet Brown. He's written a number of articles on the history of Alaska, and he is presently a professor of history at the University of California at Davis. It's my pleasure now to introduce our keynote speaker, Morgan Sherwood.
First of all, you'll have to excuse me. I may be a trifle aphasic at the beginning. Number one, I'm not accustomed to that big eye staring at me. And number two, I make a policy of never lecturing before 10 o'clock. But I do want to thank Mr. Hornaday and everyone, special thanks to all of you who helped to arrange this conference and gave me the opportunity to meet and to mingle with Kenai history buffs. Your thoughtful invitation could not have been timed better. I've spent some part of more than 35 years, calendar years in Alaska, but this year my wife and I, for personal reasons, could not stay in our Alaskan home on Kachemak Bay. So now you know my Alaskan antiquity. And as you all know, in Alaska, it's important for any Alaskan specialist to verify his credentials by first citing the amount of time he spent in the country. For historians, the dating ritual usually has nothing whatever to do with the quality of a person's historical research or writing. Some newcomers know more of Alaskan's history than some old-timers. And Hector Chevenix, the most widely read historian of Alaska, did not even visit here until late in life, when he was already blind. But I should confess quickly, having given you my Alaskan antiquity, that my arrival in Alaska during the late 1920s was against my will, or at least without my consent. Neither my father, mother, nor her physician troubled to make any prenatal inquiries, which was rather thoughtless, inconsiderate at least, because 2 days later the stock market crashed. I don't want to suggest any causal relation. My father might. I hope this visit isn't a new distress signal to Wall Street. A third reason why I should be thankful for your invitation, along with the chance to meet Kenai historians and visit the peninsula, is that after 4 years of researching an institution in the history of American technology, I began last winter to search for an Alaskan topic suitable for historical investigation, and settle tentatively on some part of the history of the Kenai. Exactly what part I'm not yet certain. I hope this conference will give me a few ideas. In the meantime, I've reviewed many of the printed primary sources and am fascinated by the opportunities. With good luck, my previous comments will self-destruct. As I was saying, I have reviewed many of the primary sources, the printed primary sources, and the opportunities this region offers for historical research. Significant historical research are many. Research into both the detail and the generality, into both antiquarian and interpretive questions. The Kenai region is an important transitional area between different peoples, different geographies, different resources, different occupations. The peninsula itself is a transitional area for two major geographic biologic provinces, two native cultures, two national policies, three ethnic groups, four natural resource industries, and three sociological personalities. Furthermore, it seems to me, because of climate and proximity to the state's population center, it seems to me that the Kenai area is the Alaskan region most likely to develop soon. So, how can a region so attractive and significant as a transitional area for so many things, natural and man-made, have remained relatively unexamined by historians for so long? I don't propose today to attempt any systematic answer to that question for the simple reason that I don't know enough Kenai area history yet. Instead, I'd like to sample, and sample only, some of the new and old, big and little, solved and unsolved historical mysteries of the Kenai. Some or perhaps all of these history mysteries will be familiar to some or perhaps all of you. I don't apologize. Repetition is a legitimate pedagogical technique. And in order to avoid accusations that I don't practice what I teach, I'll go back to 3 questions which I insist my students address in any research paper they write for me. What happened? Why? And so what? Our first mystery is probably no mystery to the anthropology, especially a linguist like Mr. Kari. But I never thought much about the issue until last month when I began to jot down a few thoughts for this talk. The question is, what is the origin and meaning of the name Kenai? It's always a good place to start by finding out why you are named the way you are named. The 2 standard geographic dictionaries are not conclusive or even very helpful. Donald Orth's Dictionary of Alaskan Place Names says that the name of the peninsula was, quote, probably derived from Kenaiskaya, the name given by the Russians in the 1790s to Cook Inlet and called by Joseph Billings Kenaiski Land in 1802. Marcus Baker's earlier Geographic Dictionary of Alaska, on which Orth relied heavily, though without sufficient precision for our problem, Baker is more instructive if not as wordy. Baker recorded, and this is a complete sentence, native name from the Russians. So, from these sources we know when the peninsula got its name, and the name is a Russian version of an Indian word, and that's about all we learn from Baker and Orth. Most of you here will know that anthropologists call the Athabascan inhabitants of this part of Alaska Tenaina, T-A-N-A-I-N-A, which sounds something like Kenai. So I turn next to the earliest complete ethnographic map of Alaska, which was handy, H.J. Holmberg's, dated 1854. And sure enough, he uses the designation Tenaina, spelled differently, with the explanation Tenaina, Kenaitsi, of the Kenai Peninsula. At this point, I was satisfied prematurely that Kenai was a corruption of Tenai, but I still didn't know what the word meant or who corrupted it. Then I remembered from my earlier research that Holmberg relied heavily on Lieutenant Zagoskin's work, and Zagoskin's book contained Athabascan vocabularies. On page 309 of a new translation of Zagoskin's travels in 1842-44, the Ingalik Athabascan word for a person is, I'm not sure I can pronounce this, Tenai, T-T-Y-N-A-I-Y, which was close enough for a careless amateur, like myself, aware that the name of many indigenous Americans translate the people or the man. And I would have let it go at that if one of Zagoskin's footnotes had not caught my eye, and the note is worth quoting. It's also a lesson in why you should read footnotes, on occasion anyway. Quote, in the 18th century, when our roving discoverers little by little were occupying the islands and then finally settled on the American mainland, the native names were communicated to the scientific world through illiterate and uninformed people. Through such people, we have arrived at names of tribes which are often inventions, or have been made to conform in sound to the Russian. For example, Aluchi, Kaloshi, Kajatsky, Kinaitsky. The last of these names clearly originates in the native name Tenai or Tenay, end quote. Well, however unkind Zagoskin was to his predecessors in that one sentence, the statement would appear to clear the decks, except that Zagoskin goes on. Again, quote, Kinayut, K-I-N-A-Y-U-T, as the Kodiak natives call the Tenay, means in literal translation, they call themselves people, from the verb kina, to call, and yuk, man. In other words, Kenai may not be a corruption of Tenay by illiterate and uninformed Russians, but instead a close rendering of what the Kodiak natives, according to the Russians, called the Kenai people, not what those people call themselves. So the mystery remained. Is Kenai a corruption of the native word for people, or is it the Kodiak name for the Cook Inlet folks? I was forced to go to the earliest relevant source in my private library, to Baron Rangel's statistical and ethnographical reports, dated 1839, upon which Zagoskin relied directly or indirectly. If the reliance were direct, just as Orth did not report Baker precisely, Zagoskin did not report Rangel precisely, and we can quote Rangel. The Kenais call themselves Tenaina, from Tenai, man. To the inhabitants of Kodiak, they are known under the name Kenayut, the name also used by the Russians, end quote. So the mystery for me, at least, was solved by Rangel, though Rangel must have got his information from somebody who got his information from somebody else. But one must budget one's research time. And anyway, I was over my head in foreign languages and sciences and historical specialties. Nevertheless, the detective work, however much time I may have wasted, or however much I may have distorted the truth of the matter, Mr. Curry, the detective work was good fun, and that's one of the main points I want to make today in recounting some of these history mysteries. The details of our second mystery may be less familiar to you. The puzzle never occurred to me until early this year when I was translating, with great effort I might add, translating the Cook Inlet part of Jakobson's Voyage to the Northwest Coast of America. The year was 1883, and Jakobson, a Scandinavian ethnological explorer collecting artifacts for the Berlin Museum of Cultural Anthropology, was at English Bay, awaiting transportation to Kodiak. He writes, "On the day of my arrival, Mr. Frank imparted the information that farther up Kachemak Bay from where I crossed are situated the ruins of an old abandoned native village named Sunrudna, and that it would possibly repay the effort to make an excavation at this home of the Hardak Eskimos," end quote. Jakobson decided that he had sufficient time. At Seldovia, he hired an elderly Indian whose ancestors had lived in the abandoned village. Jakobson stopped at Yukon Island, and then he sailed to his destination. "The place," he wrote, "is located between the three glaciers on the south coast of Kachemak Bay. Sunrudna was a large village even before 1794 when the Russians came. Shortly after they had built Fort Kenai, they sailed one day in many boats to Sunrudna and abducted from here, in a second edition of The Rape of the Sabine Women, all of the young girls and women whom they took to the fort and in this way procured wives. The natives, who saw that they were powerless against the Russians, abandoned their home in angry sorrow and scattered themselves around Kodiak Island to settle there anew among the Eskimo inhabitants. Before the advent of the Russians, the original inhabitants of Sunrudna cremated their dead and buried the remains. They were all that was left when the residents themselves abandoned the village," end quote. So my curiosity was titillated. What may have been the largest and last native town on Kachemak Bay, abandoned after a great tragedy, was somewhere near my Alaskan home. Now, it always helps. It always helps to have a personal as well as a scholarly and intellectual interest in the topic of your investigation. But where was Sunrudna? Jakobson's description was not too revealing. About 30 miles round trip from English Bay, a few hours sailing from Yukon Island, located below three glaciers on the south shore of Kachemak Bay. As you all know, there are more than three glaciers on that coast. I had no idea how fast Jakobson's boat sailed, and his mileage sounded like a guess. Jakobson's papers, containing a more precise description, might be in Berlin or someplace else, but that would take too much time to determine, and after all, the subject wasn't in my field, as we say. So I went scurrying around for a copy of Frederica de Laguna's Archaeology of Cook Inlet. That book is hard to find. For reasons that elude me, it's never been reprinted. Anyway, that magic service called Interlibrary Loan finally sent me a copy, and lo, there was no mention of Sunrudna, and Jakobson's book is not listed in the bibliography. It did appear, however, that Sunrudna was probably at one of three sites, at Chinapoot, Halibut Cove, or Aurora Spit. Professor de Laguna, in a prompt and thoughtful answer to my written inquiry, regretted that she hadn't tried to locate Sunrudna in her book, The Archaeology of Cook Inlet. In a later book, she guessed that the place was Chinapoot, based upon Jakobson's description and upon the fact that Na meant river. But she hastened to repeat that it was only a guess. Therefore, unless some one or more of the platoons of anthropologists who have mucked around the bay since De Laguna happen to know, perhaps Mr. Workman does, Sunrudna is still lost, its location still a mystery. Our third mystery is about a lost colony also, a lost colony familiar to readers of Svetlana Fedorova's Russian Population in Alaska and California. That book, now available in translation from the Limestone Press, is a mine of information about many things Kenaian, and a substantial part is devoted to explaining how scholars here and in the USSR erroneously believed for a long time that there was substance to the story that Kisilov was the site of a pre-Bering Russian colony composed of Novgorodians who fled their birthplace about 1571 during the reign of Ivan the Terrible. My own interest in this particular mystery was fleeting. In 1966, when I was putting together an anthology of Alaskan history articles written by others, a referee for the publisher asked why I failed to include one of Theodore Farrelly's essays, which speculated on the existence of the pre-Bering Russian colony. And my reply after a re-examination of the article was based upon internal evidence only, and said, your reader can't be serious about including the Farrelly article. It's a fairy tale supported by fanciful, poor, and irrelevant evidence. I actually said more than that, but there is no need to communicate here in a public school some of the earthy language that even historians use in their private communications. At about this time, in casual shop talk, Richard Pierce told me the whole story of the fictitious colony and how high Soviet scholars were hung up on it. I don't know why such issues fascinate the Soviets, perhaps because the topics are apolitical, which does not, of course, prevent them from occasionally quoting some irrelevant passage from Karl Marx to give their narratives ideological sanction. At any rate, by this time, or by that time, Pierce knew the speculations of Farrelly and the Soviets were false, although I don't think Pierce mentioned it in print before the publication of his remarks at the Alaska History Conference at Alaska Methodist University in 1967. The story goes something like this, and I rely on Fedorova and Pierce. In 1937, an article in the Anchorage Daily Times reported the discovery of a village site on the peninsula, a discovery by land surveyors who were accompanied by a student anthropologist. The article mentioned bricks and logs. The engineer's report did not mention bricks and logs. Neither the article nor the engineer's report of the find mentioned any Russian connection. Instead, both thought the site might be Eskimo. Merle Colby, author of the Federal Writers Project Guide to Alaska, published in 1939, noted the newspaper article and included a short reference to the find, but Colby did not mention any Russian connection either. Meanwhile, back in the States, Theodore Farrelly was pursuing his interest in early Russian settlement in Alaska, and the Colby reference seemed to relate to certain letters of Father Herman, the recently sainted Russian churchman. The letters apparently contain some speculation about Novgorodians and a report from employees of the Lebedev Company in the late 18th century that there were other Russians near their posts on the peninsula. Putting these two pieces of unverified evidence together and then drawing unjustified inferences from other sources, Farrelly made the connection. In an article published in 1944 in a respectable scholarly journal, he outlined the case for a pre-Bering Russian colony near Kasilov. Farrelly's lost colony was adopted by several Soviet academicians, including the highly respected A.V. Efimov, giving the story a dignity, as Pierce says, out of all proportion to the dubious original. Well, thanks to the work of Fedorova and Pierce, we can now reject the story, and in doing so, wonder why none of the earlier scholars were satisfied with the possible discovery of a lost prehistoric Eskimo village. The fourth mystery relates to a story from the Russian period that you must know because it's a good story, too good. A story that was circulated in detail by Hubert Howe Bancroft in his History of Alaska, published in 1886, and by Hector Chevigny in his book Lord of Alaska, published in 1942. Now, my own connection with the mystery was not casual. I wish it had been. During my research into the early American exploration of Alaska, I stumbled onto some puzzling documents concerning the career of Ivan Petrov, Bancroft's hired hand, and an important source of information about Alaska during the Russian period. A further investigation revealed that Petrov had, on more than one occasion, been something more than inaccurate in his work. In telling the story of Petrov, I included a short note about Father Juvenal's so-called journal, and that note involved me rather more than I cared to be involved in what was really a subject for investigation by specialists in the Russian period and authorities on church history. Juvenal, as you know, was a Russian monk who near the end of the 18th century arrived in Alaska to do missionary work. He left this place for Iliamna, where he was martyred by the natives. Now, the story of what happened, as reported by Bancroft and Chevenix, was based on a manuscript in English located in the Bancroft Library at Berkeley that purported to be a translation of Juvenal's diary or journal carried to Nushagak after Juvenal's death. If there were an original diary, it had vanished mysteriously. The story told in the manuscript is fascinating. Juvenal arrived, began to minister to the natives, tried to prohibit polygamy, and was subverted when the locals compromised the monk's virtue with the aid of a young lady. Disgraced, Juvenal was then murdered. The story, as we've said, was too good, too pat, especially if you worked among the manuscript materials from which Bancroft wrote his history, and if you knew some of Petroff's other delinquencies. I discussed the matter with Helen Shanitz, then librarian at the State Library in Juneau. She prepared an internal analysis for me, the gist of which was that the author of the Juvenal manuscript could not have been a churchman. So in print, I committed myself to the conclusion that the translation was almost certainly fraudulent and was probably Petroff's work. Now, right now, I don't know any specialist in the history of the Russian period who disagrees with that judgment, but at the time, 1963-65, a few people disagreed with the way it was stated. A book reviewer for Science magazine wrote, "Sherwood believes, perhaps somewhat intuitively, that Petroff's translation of Father Juvenal's diary is a fraud, but it was a disappointment to find that the author has little in the way of proof to back up this assertion," end quote. I like to read my bad reviews. This reviewer, who knows his Russian sources very well indeed, but who is a scientific anthropologist, perhaps doesn't realize how important historical intuition is to our rational but literary discipline. Another anthropologist, a prolific writer, reviewed the book, then suggested to me in a letter that Mrs. Shanitz's analysis was suspect, judging from what the anthropologist had heard about Shanitz. The letter concluded, quote, "All the marvelous, repeat marvelous, all the marvelous things that Juvenal wrote could have happened in one small area, even today, as I have found during my field research and through just ordinary living in Alaska, and which I am sure you also have discovered as a former resident," end quote. In a similar vein, an amateur anthropologist come historian, a resident Alaskan with a considerable reputation in the state at that time, told me, with a wink and a nudge, that what happened to Juvenal was probably true because the Iliamna girls tended to be like that. Well, such views may be dismissed for methodological and common sense reasons, but Hector Chevenix's opinions needed serious attention. In his Lord of Alaska, there is a small print statement in the bibliography after the entry for the Juvenal manuscript that reads, "Manuscript of doubtful authenticity." Chevenix once told me that Clarence Andrews, that wonderful self-taught historian who helped to keep Alaskan history respectable during a long drought, that Andrews had warned him, Chevenix, about the Juvenal manuscript and about Petroff's work in general. In a letter dated 1963, Chevenix wrote to me, quote, "The extraordinary thing is the plausibility of most of what Petroff did. Nowhere did I see any signs that, for example, he had greatly condensed some of the originals. Petroff would have done well at the Reader's Digest," end quote. Nevertheless, Chevenix, at least at that time, I think he came around before he died, Chevenix still would not accept outright that Juvenal's diary was Petroff's work. He thought it might have been a fabrication foisted on Petroff by somebody else. Chevenix thought the forgery displayed too much knowledge of church practices, exactly the reverse of the position taken by Shanitz, and perhaps Sister Victoria can help us work this problem out later. So where are we? The Juvenal diary is to all of the bona fide specialists in the Russian period whom I know and who know the Bancroft documents a fake, probably Petroff's forgery. The burden of proof now, in my opinion, rests upon those who disagree, though it isn't my business, but the business of specialists in the Russian period of Alaskan history. Simply because a document resides or exists in Bancroft Library does not make it automatically authentic, as those of you know who've read Samuel Eliot Morrison's recent, highly publicized challenge to the authenticity of Sir Francis Drake's possession plate, also in Bancroft. But there are really two mysteries here. If the juvenile manuscript is a fraud, what did in fact and in detail happen to the monk, and why did Petrov or anybody else fabricate the diary? Well, there are other historical mysteries of the Kenai, more important mysteries and lesser, though perhaps more intriguing puzzles from the Russian period, some even connected with Captain Cook. For example, what happened to the bottle planted by Cook's men on Point Possession, and to the English coins dated 1772, and the document announcing the English discovery? Vancouver's crew looked for it and couldn't find it. When it was buried, some Tenainas watched. Perhaps they took possession of the bottle taking possession, and maybe the coins will still show up. Another little mystery is only distantly related to Kenai because the Cook expedition was on its way back from Alaska at the time. Cook, as you know, charted this area during the early years of the American Revolutionary War. The question, it's more of a minor question than a complicated mystery, is why Benjamin Franklin issued his famous passport addressed to all ships operating under a commission from the Centennial Continental Congress. The document urged American captains to treat the said Captain Cook and his people with all civility and kindness, affording them as common friends to mankind all the assistance in your power which they may happen to stand in need of, end quote. The stated reason for the free passage was that Cook's voyage was truly laudable in itself, as the increase of geographical knowledge facilitates the communication between distant nations in the exchange of useful products and manufactures, and the extension of arts, whereby the common enjoyments of human life are multiplied and augmented, and science of other kinds increased to the benefit of mankind in general, end quote. Well, that's Ben's stated reason. There may have been other considerations. It's a small puzzle, but interesting. The passport was too late to do Cook himself any good. He was killed at Hawaii less than a month earlier. Now, so far, all of our mysteries are set in the Russian period, and all except the explanation of Kenai are historiographic puzzles arising during the American period. The history mysteries of the American period are numerous too, and many will still be uncovered. In a way, all of the American period is a mystery because nobody has put it all together, and only a few historians have even reported significant parts of the region's past. That conclusion, I suspect, will be accepted by Peggy Thompson, Jim Hornaday, and Mary Willits, who have been hard at work trying to put together the American side of this conference. I won't try your patience or delay the coffee break by attempting to list several unanswered questions about the American period. Instead, using a scrap of unverified evidence, I'll try to invent, in the spirit of Theodore Farrelly, a spanking new history mystery about a very recent and important event in Kenai history. A few years ago, when I'm not certain, I think during the Johnson administration in Washington, the federal government sought to prevent the state of Alaska from leasing mineral rights to the center of Cook Inlet south of Kelgan Island. With a perversity of geographical and historical judgment that mystified those of us who are not international lawyers or Washington politicians, the central government claimed that Cook Inlet did not begin at the Barren Islands or any of the obvious gateways. It began just south of Kelgan Island, and that the center of the southern inlet was international water, or at best territorial water. The state insisted that all of Cook Inlet was a mare clausum, or a closed sea, as the experts once said, or as they say now, an historic bay, like Chesapeake Bay, which also fails to conform to the legal definition of an inland waterway as set forth in modern international law. And the state claimed that Cook Inlet, in its logical entirety, had always been considered an historic bay and inland waterway, owned completely by the nation whose flag flew on shore. But I'm not interested in the legal issues. Rather, on the face of it, the major reason for the suit was the sordid issue of who would profit from underwater petroleum. But there may have been something else involved. for the spectacle of an American government giving away a chunk of the United States was, in my knowledge, unprecedented. In the middle of the controversy, which was not publicized widely for fear of prejudicing the case, whose case I'm not certain, an attorney close to the dispute told me in 1968 that a State Department official had told him, that's the piece of unverified evidence, that the State Department official had told him that the central government blocked the state's lease in order to abandon American sovereignty in that portion of Alaska for the possibility of receiving something similar abroad, specifically the right to move American spy ships closer to foreign shores or some particular foreign shore. The possibility that spy ships rather than petroleum royalties motivated the government seemed plausible, though dumb, because improvements in the technology of satellite and high-altitude spying was already rendering spy ships obsolete. But the story did seem plausible when you examined it historically. Alaska is a maritime province, and its related rights during the last few decades have occasionally been bargained away by Washington in exchange for some dubious diplomatic or international advantage. The mystery is, what was the fundamental reason for the federal government's insistence that Lower Cook Inlet become de-Americanized? Excuse me. Well, as promised, I don't know whether you want me to fulfill this promise or not. As promised, we return now to those three questions historical research and writing should try to answer. What happened, why, and so what? Can they be answered satisfactorily in each of our history mysteries? The first question, what happened, is the substance of historical research. The second question, why did it happen, is an interpretive problem as well as a research problem. The third question, so what, involves the attempt to determine the significance of the research and its conclusions. What difference does the story make to anyone? How important was it in the general scheme of things at that time, later, and how important is it now? So let's work backwards. We can determine most of what happened in the Cook Inlet case from the public record. It's a good story that somebody should research and write. But it will be difficult to verify or junk the rumor I passed along. I may not become a new Theodore Farrelly. And the resolution of that little mystery is important to a complete resolution of the second, the why question. The significance of the Cook Inlet case is pretty clear. The federal government tried to give away a piece of the United States, and a federal victory in the courts. The feds lost in March of this year, but I learned last night that they have appealed. A federal victory in the courts might also have led to jurisdictional, or might also lead to jurisdictional disputes over resource conservation policy between the state, the national government, and foreign countries, and have led also to security problems for a part of Alaska. The significance of the episode would be even wider if my hearsay evidence is correct. We don't really know what happened to Juvenal beyond his martyrdom, and we don't know in detail why he was martyred. Yeah.
This is Alaska. We've got to change the tapes.
Oh, very good.